If there's one thing Ethan knew about his grandfather George, it was that the man had a talent for turning minor inconveniences into epic battles. Whether it was arguing with the grocery store clerk over a mislabeled can of soup or waging war against the squirrels that dared to trespass in his backyard, George was the kind of man who believed every challenge was an opportunity to assert dominance. So when a black SUV with HOA Enforcement Division, plastered on its side, rolled into their driveway that Sunday morning, Ethan instinctively knew two things. First, this was going to be ridiculous. Second, someone was about to regret their life choices. It started like any other peaceful suburban morning. Ethan was in the backyard, helping George repair a sagging fence that had been battered by years of weather and neglect. George, a retired carpenter with hands as rough as sandpaper and an attitude to match, was muttering under his breath about how they don't make wood like they used to. Ethan wasn't entirely sure if wood quality had actually declined or if this was just another one of George's conspiracy theories, right up there with his belief that squirrels were secretly plotting to overthrow humanity. "Pass me the hammer," George grumbled, squinting at a crooked nail like it had personally offended him. Ethan handed him the tool and was about to ask if he wanted coffee or tea when the low growl of an engine interrupted their quiet morning. The black SUV rolled up to their driveway like it owned the place, its glossy exterior gleaming in the sunlight as if it were auditioning for a car commercial. On its side was an official-looking emblem featuring HOA in bold letters, accompanied by some generic design that screamed, "I made this in Microsoft Paint." Out stepped a man who clearly thought he was starring in his own action movie. He wore mirrored sunglasses, a tactical vest that didn't quite fit, and carried himself with the swagger of someone who just learned what probable cause meant from binge-watching cop dramas. His name tag read Brad, which somehow felt fitting. "Morning, gentlemen," Brad barked, his voice dripping with self-importance. "I'm Officer Brad from the HOA Enforcement Division." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "HOA Enforcement Division? That's new." Brad ignored him and turned his attention to George. "Sir, we've received complaints about your property violating HOA regulations. That fence is not up to code." George squinted at Brad like he was trying to decide whether this man was serious or just deeply confused. "Son," George said slowly, "this property isn't part of any HOA." Brad smirked and pulled out a clipboard that looked like it had been purchased at a dollar store clearance sale. "Actually, it is now. As of last month, your neighborhood has been annexed into the jurisdiction of the Greater Suburban HOA Alliance." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "Annexed? What is this, medieval Europe? Did you guys send knights to claim our land?" Brad's smirk faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "Laugh all you want, but this is serious business. If you don't comply with HOA regulations, there will be consequences." George crossed his arms and stared Brad down with the kind of unflinching gaze that only grandfathers possess, the kind that could make grown men reconsider their entire existence. "Listen here, Sonny. I've lived in this house for 40 years. I built that fence myself. No HOA is going to tell me what to do with my property." Brad's face turned red, whether from embarrassment or anger was unclear, and he reached for his belt holster. To Ethan's shock and mild amusement, Brad pulled out a gun and pointed it at George. "Let's not make this difficult," Brad said, his voice shaking slightly as if he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. "Hand over your property deed so we can verify compliance." Ethan froze for a second before instinct kicked in. He stepped between Brad and George, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa there, Clint Eastwood. You're pulling a gun over a fence violation? What's next? SWAT teams for unapproved garden gnomes." Brad's hand trembled as he tightened his grip on the weapon. "Don't test me." Ethan took a deep breath and decided it was time to play his trump card. He pulled out his phone and dialed Eric, a close friend who just so happened to work for the FBI. "Eric," Ethan said calmly when his friend picked up. "I need you here ASAP. We've got a wannabe cop threatening my grandpa with a gun." Eric didn't ask questions. He simply replied, "On my way." As Ethan hung up, Brad scoffed. "Calling your buddy won't help you now." Ethan smiled innocently. "Oh, I think it will. For the next 10 minutes, Ethan kept Brad distracted by engaging him in increasingly absurd debates about HOA rules, while George stood silently behind him like an immovable mountain. Ethan asked whether birdhouses required permits and whether pink flamingo lawn ornaments were considered offensive under HOA guidelines. Brad tried to answer seriously but ended up sounding ridiculous. Then came the sound of tires screeching on asphalt. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into view. Real ones this time, with flashing lights and FBI agents pouring out like ants from an anthill. At their helm was Eric, looking every bit like someone who had no patience for nonsense. Brad's face went pale as Eric approached him with an air of authority that made Brad's earlier bravado look laughable. "Drop the weapon," Eric commanded. Brad hesitated for half a second before realizing he'd made every wrong decision possible today. The gun clattered to the ground as Brad raised his hands in surrender. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Brad stammered. Eric smirked and gestured toward one of his agents to cuff Brad. "Actually, I think we do," as Brad was led away muttering incoherent excuses about protecting community standards. George turned to Ethan and grinned for the first time all morning. "Well," George said dryly, "that escalated quickly." Ethan didn't think much of HOAs before that Sunday morning. To him, they were just one of those suburban nuisances, like overly enthusiastic neighborhood watch groups or people who insisted on mowing their lawns at sunrise. But after Brad's dramatic, and frankly absurd, attempt to enforce fake HOA rules with a gun, Ethan found himself diving headfirst into the murky world of HOA fraud and corruption. What he uncovered was a rabbit hole so deep and ridiculous, it could have been the plot of a bad soap opera. The first revelation came when Ethan decided to figure out how Brad's so-called Greater Suburban HOA Alliance even existed. George, still fuming from the encounter, handed Ethan a stack of papers Brad had left behind. The documents were an incoherent mess of legal jargon, typos, and vague threats about community standards. One page even misspelled jurisdiction as jurdiction, which George pointed out with glee. "These clowns can't even spell," he muttered. Ethan started researching HOA governing documents and quickly learned that legitimate HOAs operate under strict legal frameworks. They rely on documents like covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, bylaws, and articles of incorporation, all filed with state or local authorities. Brad's group, however, had none of these. Instead, they seemed to have cobbled together a Frankenstein-like set of rules that were as legally binding as monopoly money. "Grandpa," Ethan said after hours of reading HOA horror stories online, "this isn't just some wannabe HOA. This is an outright scam." George nodded sagely. "I knew it the moment that idiot started talking about annexing neighborhoods like he was Napoleon." Ethan's next move was to dig deeper into Brad's operation. He discovered that fake HOAs weren't as uncommon as he'd thought. In fact, there were documented cases of people creating phony associations to extort homeowners. Some scams involved sending fraudulent fines for things like grass being too high or parking in the wrong spot. Others went as far as manipulating elections to install puppet board members who would funnel money into shell companies. The audacity was mind-boggling. Brad's group seemed to fall somewhere in the middle, less sophisticated than embezzlers but more organized than your average con artist. They operated by targeting neighborhoods without existing HOAs, claiming to have annexed them under a larger umbrella organization. They would then send enforcers like Brad to intimidate residents into compliance. Their ultimate goal? To collect bogus dues and fees under the guise of maintaining community standards. Ethan couldn't believe how many people had fallen for similar schemes. You'd think people would notice when their HOA president drives a beat-up minivan and spells maintenance wrong on official letters, he joked to George. But George wasn't laughing anymore. He was angry, and when George got angry, things happened. "We're not letting these crooks get away with this," he declared. Ethan agreed wholeheartedly. He decided to start by gathering evidence against Brad and his associates. Using his military background, Ethan approached the situation like a reconnaissance mission. He began interviewing neighbors who had also been targeted by the fake HOA. One neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, revealed that she'd been fined $200 for having unauthorized flowers in her garden, flowers she'd planted 20 years ago. Another neighbor complained about being charged $50 for parking his car on his own driveway because it supposedly violated HOA aesthetic guidelines. Ethan collected dozens of similar stories and compiled them into a dossier that would make any FBI agent proud. But Ethan wasn't done yet. He wanted to know who was behind this operation and why they thought they could get away with it. After some sleuthing online, he discovered that the so-called Greater Suburban HOA Alliance wasn't registered anywhere. Not with the state, not with the county, not even on Google Maps. It was essentially a phantom organization created by Brad and a few accomplices to scam unsuspecting homeowners. Ethan also found out that Brad had been running this scheme for years in different neighborhoods across the state. His tactics were always the same. Show up in a fancy-looking SUV, make vague threats about compliance, and collect as much money as possible before disappearing when things got too hot. Armed with this information, Ethan decided it was time to strike back. Not just for his grandfather, but for every homeowner who'd been bullied by Brad's fake HOA. Step 1 was getting more neighbors involved. Ethan organized a community meeting where he presented all the evidence he'd gathered. The turnout was better than expected. Apparently, word had spread about Brad's gun-waving antics at George's house. Ethan started the meeting with a slideshow titled, "How Not to Run an HOA," featuring pictures of Brad looking ridiculous in his oversized tactical vest. The crowd laughed nervously but quickly grew serious as Ethan outlined the extent of the scam. "We're not dealing with an actual HOA here," Ethan explained. "This is fraud, plain and simple." The neighbors were outraged but also motivated to take action. Together, they decided to file complaints with local authorities and hire a lawyer to pursue legal action against Brad and his associates. Step 2 was exposing Brad publicly. Ethan created a website called HOA Hall of Shame, where he posted all the evidence against Brad's group along with testimonials from victims. The site quickly gained traction, attracting attention from local media outlets. Within days, reporters were knocking on Brad's door asking questions he couldn't answer without incriminating himself further. One particularly memorable news segment featured Brad stammering through an interview while trying, and failing, to explain why his supposed HOA didn't have any official documentation. Step 3 was ensuring that Brad faced real consequences. Thanks to Ethan's efforts and Eric's connections at the FBI, Brad was arrested on charges of fraud and intimidation. His accomplices weren't far behind. One by one, they were rounded up like characters in a poorly written crime drama. When news broke about the arrests, George couldn't resist making one last joke. "Looks like our fence isn't the only thing getting fixed around here." For Ethan, though, the satisfaction came from knowing he'd helped protect his community from scammers like Brad, and sent a clear message that homeowners wouldn't be bullied into submission. Ethan thought the battle was over after Brad and his merry band of fraudsters were hauled off by the authorities. But, as it turns out, the universe wasn't quite done with delivering absurdity to his doorstep. What should have been a clean victory quickly spiraled into a new level of chaos, because apparently, when you take down a fake HOA, you don't just get rid of the fraudsters, you also inherit their mess. It all started with an unexpected knock on the door one morning. Ethan opened it to find a man in a cheap suit, holding a clipboard and wearing an expression that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." He introduced himself as Doug, a court-appointed receiver tasked with managing the assets of the now-defunct Greater Suburban HOA Alliance. "Wait," Ethan said, blinking. "You're telling me that scam operation had assets?" Doug sighed like he'd been asked this question too many times already. "Technically, yes. There are outstanding dues, fines, and liens that need to be sorted out." Ethan stared at him. "You mean the fake dues and fake fines from the fake HOA? Doug nodded solemnly. "Fake or not, someone has to clean up the paperwork." Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So let me get this straight, you're here to collect money from people who were scammed so you can what? Pay off the scammers' imaginary debts." Doug shrugged. "I don't make the rules. I just enforce them." Ethan slammed the door in Doug's face and immediately called George to vent. George listened patiently before offering his usual sage advice. "If they want to play stupid games, let's make sure they win stupid prizes." Inspired by his grandfather's words, Ethan decided to attend the first community meeting organized by Doug and his clipboard of doom. The meeting was held at the local library, in a room that smelled faintly of mildew and disappointment. About 20 neighbors showed up, all of them looking equally confused and annoyed. Doug stood at the front of the room, flipping through a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Transitioning Your HOA, a Guide to Moving Forward." The slides were filled with stock photos of smiling families and perfectly manicured lawns, none of which remotely resembled their actual neighborhood. "Thank you all for coming," Doug began in a monotone voice that could have put an insomniac to sleep. "I know this has been a challenging time for everyone, but we're here to ensure a smooth transition." Ethan raised his hand. "Transition to what? A new scam?" Doug frowned. "No, sir. We're here to establish legitimate governance for your community." Another neighbor chimed in. "We don't want governance. We just want these people out of our lives." Doug held up a hand like he was trying to calm an unruly classroom. "I understand your frustration, but without some form of oversight, your neighborhood could fall into disarray." George, who had insisted on attending despite Ethan's protests, snorted loudly from the back of the room. "Disarray? Son, this neighborhood has been running just fine for 40 years, without anyone telling us what color we can paint our mailboxes." Doug ignored him and clicked to the next slide, which outlined proposed rules for forming a new HOA. The list included gems like mandatory lawn inspections, restrictions on outdoor decorations, and a ban on parking trucks in driveways. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and pointed at Doug like he was accusing him in a courtroom drama. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to fix a scam by creating another scam." The room erupted into applause and cheers as Ethan continued his tirade. "We don't need an HOA. We don't need fines or rules or some bureaucrat with a clipboard telling us how to live our lives. What we need is for you, and Brad's entire mess, to leave us alone." Doug looked genuinely flustered for the first time since arriving. He fumbled with his clipboard before muttering something about needing to consult his supervisor. After that disaster of a meeting, Ethan decided it was time to take matters into his own hands, again. He rallied the neighbors and proposed an alternative solution. Instead of forming another HOA or letting Doug impose rules on them, they would create a voluntary neighborhood association focused solely on improving their community without any legal authority or mandatory fees. The idea was met with overwhelming support because, frankly, no one wanted another Brad situation. Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly with George and other neighbors to organize their new association. They held potlucks instead of formal meetings and used social media groups instead of official newsletters. Instead of enforcing rules with threats or fines, they encouraged participation through goodwill and mutual respect. The results were nothing short of miraculous, or at least mildly impressive for a group of suburbanites who'd never agreed on anything before. Mrs. Jenkins finally got help weeding her garden, and no one charged her $200 for it. The neighbor with the truck parked in his driveway offered free rides to anyone who needed help moving heavy furniture. Someone even started organizing weekly trash pickups to clean up litter around the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Doug continued lurking around like an unwanted houseguest who didn't know when to leave. He kept trying to schedule follow-up meetings about forming an official HOA but found himself increasingly ignored as more residents embraced Ethan's vision for their community. Eventually, Doug gave up entirely after receiving an anonymous letter, written by George, that read, "Dear Doug, we appreciate your efforts but have decided we prefer freedom over tyranny. Best wishes in your future endeavors, preferably far away from here." With Doug out of the picture and Brad safely behind bars awaiting trial, life in the neighborhood finally returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when George was involved. One afternoon, as Ethan sat on the porch sipping lemonade with his grandfather, George leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this whole thing might have been worth it just to see that clipboard guy squirm." Ethan laughed and raised his glass in agreement. For once, everything felt right in their little corner of suburbia. No HOAs, no scams, just good neighbors looking out for each other. And if anyone ever dared show up claiming otherwise, well, they'd have another thing coming. Ethan thought the neighborhood had finally found peace. No more fake HOAs, no more clipboard-wielding bureaucrats, and no more gun-waving Brad. Life was good, or at least as good as it could be in a suburb where half the residents still argued about whether recycling bins should go on the left or right side of the driveway. But just when Ethan thought he could relax, a new problem emerged, proving once again that suburban life was nothing if not creatively chaotic. It started with an email. Ethan opened his inbox one morning to find a message from Doug, the same Doug who had been unceremoniously ousted by George's anonymous letter. The subject line read, "Urgent. HOA legal proceedings update." Ethan groaned and clicked on it, already bracing himself for whatever nonsense Doug was about to unleash. The email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. Doug explained that, despite the neighborhood's refusal to form an official HOA, there were still unresolved legal matters regarding Brad's fraudulent operation. Apparently, Brad had filed counterclaims against several residents, accusing them of defamation for exposing his scam. The irony was so thick Ethan could have spread it on toast. "Grandpa," Ethan called out, marching into the living room with his laptop. "You're not going to believe this." George looked up from his crossword puzzle and raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Clipboard guy is back?" "Worse," Ethan said, plopping down on the couch. "Brad's suing us for defamation." George stared at him for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Defamation? That idiot waved a gun at me. What's he going to claim? Damages to his reputation as a professional scam artist." Ethan sighed. "Apparently, he thinks we ruined his business." George leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the absurdity of it all. "Well, if he wants to play lawyer, I say we play along." And so began phase 2 of Ethan and George's suburban revenge saga. Ethan decided to tackle Brad's lawsuit head-on by assembling a legal dream team, or at least as close to one as he could get without spending a fortune on actual lawyers. He enlisted the help of Sarah, a neighbor who had once taken a paralegal course online and now considered herself an expert in all things legal. Sarah showed up at Ethan's house with a stack of books titled Law for Dummies, and immediately started highlighting sections she deemed relevant. "Okay," Sarah said, flipping through one of the books. "Defamation requires proof that someone made false statements that caused harm to Brad's reputation." George snorted from across the room. "Harm to his reputation? The man's reputation is already in the gutter." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. Which means we can argue that any statements made about him were true, and therefore not defamatory." Ethan grinned. "So basically, all we have to do is prove that Brad really is as terrible as everyone says he is?" "Pretty much," Sarah replied. With Sarah leading the charge, Ethan and George began gathering evidence to defend themselves against Brad's ridiculous claims. They compiled witness statements from neighbors who had been scammed by Brad, photographs of his fake HOA documents, complete with misspelled words, and even video footage of Brad waving his gun around like he was auditioning for an action movie. But Ethan wasn't content with just defending himself. He wanted to turn the tables on Brad entirely. Using Sarah's legal knowledge and George's flair for drama, they decided to file a countersuit against Brad for harassment and emotional distress. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how surreal the whole situation was. The courtroom was packed with neighbors who had come to support him and George, or maybe they just wanted front-row seats to what promised to be the most entertaining legal spectacle in town. Brad showed up wearing a suit that looked like it had been borrowed from a thrift store clearance rack. He carried himself with an air of misplaced confidence, clearly believing he could charm his way out of trouble. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Carter, looked unimpressed as Brad began presenting his case. "Your Honor," Brad said, puffing out his chest like he was delivering a TED Talk. "These individuals have spread malicious lies about me and my organization." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "Your organization? You mean the fake HOA you were running?" Brad faltered but quickly recovered. "I wouldn't call it fake. It was an innovative approach to community management." George leaned over to Ethan and whispered loudly enough for half the courtroom to hear. "Innovative? Is that what they're calling scams these days?" Brad shot George a glare but continued rambling about how his reputation had been irreparably damaged by the neighborhood's actions. When it was Ethan's turn to present his case, He wasted no time tearing apart Brad's arguments with cold hard facts and plenty of humor. "Your Honor," Ethan began, holding up one of Brad's fake HOA documents. "This man tried to enforce rules that don't exist using paperwork that looks like it was typed by a drunk raccoon." The courtroom erupted into laughter as Judge Carter struggled to maintain her composure. "And let's not forget," Ethan continued, pulling out his phone to play video footage of Brad waving his gun at George. "This is how he handled rule enforcement. If anything damaged Brad's reputation, it was, well, Brad." By the time Ethan finished presenting his evidence, and Sarah delivered her carefully crafted legal arguments, it was clear that Brad didn't stand a chance. Judge Carter ruled in favor of Ethan and George, dismissing Brad's defamation claims entirely and awarding them damages for harassment and emotional distress. She also ordered Brad to pay restitution to every neighbor he had scammed during his fake HOA reign. As Brad slunk out of the courtroom looking like a defeated cartoon villain, George turned to Ethan with a triumphant grin. "Well," George said cheerfully, "I think we taught him a lesson." Ethan laughed. "Yeah. Don't mess with this neighborhood." For once, justice had prevailed in their little corner of suburbia, and Ethan couldn't help but feel proud of what they'd accomplished together. With Brad defeated and the neighborhood free from the shadow of his fake HOA empire, Ethan thought his life might finally return to normal. But normal was a relative term in a community where his grandfather George still treated squirrels like enemy combatants and Mrs. Jenkins insisted on baking cookies shaped like legal documents to commemorate their courtroom victory. Ethan had learned one thing throughout this ordeal. Suburban drama was like weeds. It never truly went away. It just changed shape. The aftermath of their legal triumph was a mix of relief and absurdity. For starters, Brad's restitution payments were hilariously small. Apparently, his innovative approach to community management hadn't been very lucrative, and he'd spent most of his ill-gotten gains on tactical vests and fake badges. When the first check arrived, a whopping $47.32, George held it up like a trophy. "Well, Ethan," George said, grinning, "looks like we're rich." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Don't spend it all in one place." George immediately announced he was going to use the money to buy a new squirrel trap, much to Ethan's dismay. "Grandpa, can we not start another war with the wildlife?" But George was already browsing online for state-of-the-art squirrel deterrence, muttering about how he'd finally outsmart them this time. Meanwhile, the neighborhood association Ethan had helped create was thriving, or at least as much as any loosely organized group of suburbanites could thrive. They held monthly potlucks where everyone brought dishes that were suspiciously similar to store-bought items. Mrs. Jenkins swore her lasagna was homemade, but Ethan had seen her sneaking it out of a Costco box. They also started hosting DIY workshops, where George taught people how to fix fences without accidentally annexing their property into a fake HOA. The highlight of these gatherings was always George's storytelling sessions. He'd recount their battle against Brad with dramatic flair, embellishing details until it sounded like they'd taken down an international crime syndicate instead of one guy with bad spelling and a gun fetish. And then, George would say, waving his hands for emphasis, the judge looked Brad right in the eye and said, "You're a disgrace to humanity." Ethan would groan from the corner. "Grandpa, she didn't say that." "Close enough," George would reply with a wink. Despite the occasional exaggeration, the neighborhood genuinely appreciated Ethan and George's efforts to protect them from scams, and they weren't shy about showing their gratitude. One neighbor even gifted Ethan a custom-made t-shirt that read, "HOA Slayer." Ethan wasn't sure whether to laugh or cringe when he saw it, but George insisted he wear it at every potluck. As for Doug, the clipboard-wielding bureaucrat who had tried and failed to impose new HOA rules, he seemed to have vanished into thin air after their courtroom victory. Ethan liked to imagine him sitting in some distant office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork labeled "Rejected HOA Proposals," muttering about how ungrateful suburbanites didn't appreciate his genius. But just when Ethan thought things couldn't get any stranger, an unexpected visitor showed up at their door one afternoon. Eric, the FBI agent who had helped take down Brad in the first place. "Eric!" Ethan exclaimed, surprised but pleased to see his friend. "What brings you here?" Eric grinned and held up a folder. "I thought you might want to see this." Ethan invited him inside, and they sat down at the kitchen table while George hovered nearby, pretending not to eavesdrop. Eric opened the folder and revealed a series of documents detailing Brad's other scams across the state. Apparently, their neighborhood wasn't the first or last community Brad had targeted with his fake HOA schemes. In fact, there were dozens of similar cases where Brad had bullied homeowners into paying bogus fines or signing fraudulent contracts. "What's interesting," Eric said, flipping through the pages, "is that some of these neighborhoods are still dealing with fallout from Brad's scams." Ethan frowned. "You mean they haven't been able to shut him down completely?" Eric nodded. "It's complicated. Some people are too scared to fight back. Others don't know where to start." George slammed his hand on the table. "Well, that's just unacceptable. Someone needs to teach these folks how to stand up for themselves." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And let me guess, you think we should be those people?" George grinned mischievously. "Why not? We've got experience." Before Ethan could protest, Eric chimed in. "Actually, that's not a bad idea." And so began what Ethan reluctantly dubbed their Neighborhood Justice Initiative. With Eric providing legal guidance and George leading motivational pep talks, which mostly consisted of yelling things like, "Don't let them push you around." They started reaching out to other communities affected by Brad's scams. Their efforts quickly gained traction as word spread about their success in taking down Brad's fake HOA empire. Homeowners from all over began contacting them for advice on how to fight back against similar schemes. And George couldn't have been happier. "This is our calling," he declared one evening while drafting an email titled, "How to Outwit Scammers, a Beginner's Guide." Ethan wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry as he watched his grandfather turn into some kind of suburban vigilante guru. Despite the chaos and occasional moments of sheer absurdity, Ethan couldn't deny that their initiative was making a real difference. Communities that had once felt powerless were now banding together to expose fraudsters and reclaim their neighborhoods. As for Ethan himself, well, he still wasn't sure how he'd gone from fixing fences on quiet Sunday mornings to leading anti-scam workshops alongside his squirrel-obsessed grandfather. But if there was one thing he'd learned throughout this entire ordeal, it was that sometimes life throws you curveballs, and you just have to swing for the fences, pun intended. By the end of it all, Ethan couldn't help but feel proud. Not just of what they'd accomplished, but also of how their neighborhood had come together in the face of adversity. Sure, they weren't perfect. Mrs. Jenkins still insisted her cookies were homemade. But they'd proven that even ordinary people could stand up against extraordinary stupidity and win. And if anyone ever dared try another scam in their community, well, let's just say they'd have more than squirrels to worry about. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts below or share your own tales of suburban chaos. We love hearing from you. Thanks for watching.